Gary used to joke, "Well, he's on a 12-year scholarship to the University of Outer Mongolia." One day he was there, standing taller than Richie Cunningham, shouting casual insults at the dinner table while holding a basketball. And suddenly he vanished without a trace. No farewell, no justification, not even a casual reference. Chuck, Richie's older brother, seemed to have never been there. Fans have been wondering for decades, how does a family member vanish from one of television's biggest sitcoms without a trace? Chuck was the oldest Cunningham sibling, and if you watched the first season or two of Happy Days in the mid-1970s, you would have recognized him. Before going upstairs to study, he would stop by the house, get something from the refrigerator, and give a brief, informal wave. He was the tall, laid-back college basketball player. Although he did not play a major role, his presence balanced the dynamics within the household. He was a subtly consistent element in the early structure of the show. Then it was gone. Not moving out of state to attend college, not working abroad, not leaving to enlist in the army, just gone. The Cunninghams acted as though Richie had only one sibling, his sister Joni, in subsequent seasons. There was no acknowledgement, no adapting, no grieving. Howard Cunningham, the patriarch, mentioned having 2 children even in the last episode, but he made no mention of his eldest son. Viewers dismissed it for years, thinking perhaps they had missed 1 or 2 episodes that clarified it. However, there was neither a concealed script in the archives nor a lost episode, both in the real-life story behind the scenes and in the fictional world of Happy Days. Chuck Cunningham had just disappeared. The peculiarity gained so much notoriety that it gave rise to a name in popular culture, Chuck Cunningham syndrome. The occurrence of a fictional character on television going missing and appearing to have never been there. Even cast members have made jokes about how perplexing the mystery was, despite the fact that viewers have been captivated by it for decades. The renowned Fonzie himself, Henry Winkler, shared a witty reminder on social media in August 2025. He never came downstairs after going upstairs. A mystery. It was an indication to fans that, indeed, the disappearance was as odd to the show's creators as it was to its viewers. However, beyond the laughs and decades of fan theories, there is a surprisingly complex story that includes shifting priorities, artistic choices, frustrations behind the scenes, and maybe even a quiet television experiment. The cast lineup was not the only thing altered by the mystery surrounding Chuck Cunningham's disappearance. Happy Days changed in ways that no one could have foreseen. In the story's first twist, the actor portraying Chuck made the decision to leave. Irish-born actor Gavin O'Hurl, who played Chuck Cunningham in the 1974 film Happy Days, had the ideal appearance for a laid-back collegiate athlete, thanks to his tall stature and easy smile. The position first appeared to be a promising recurrent one. He appeared in Gary Marshall's popular new sitcom, which was supported by a talented ensemble cast and set in an idealized 1950s America. However, O'Hurley soon saw that Chuck would not be a popular figure, not at all. Years later, in interviews, O'Hurl described how severely underwritten he felt the character was. His character seldom ever spoke more than a few lines per episode, and when he did, it was usually just one joke or a passing reference to his basketball career. He once said he did little more than grunt, bounce a basketball, and go from his job on the show. That was scarcely satisfying for a young actor who was anxious to push his abilities. O'Hurl aspired to do more significant work behind the scenes, particularly in movies. Before Happy Days, he had acted in a few films, and was sure he could get more intriguing parts. The writing on the wall was visible to him. Chuck would never develop into a nuanced, enduring character on the show. If anything, the Cunningham family was losing all of their prominence in favor of another figure, a leather-jacketed mechanic, who was quickly rising to fame. O'Hurley, therefore, took the risky option to quit in the middle of the second season. This was not a case of expulsion or termination. He reportedly didn't want to continue playing a role that he believed had no future. It was dangerous for a 20-something actor to leave a hit TV show. O'Hurl, however, didn't think twice. He firmly closed the door on Chuck Cunningham, even declining requests to return later, once the show was more established. The exit caused an immediate issue for the production crew. Despite being a supporting character, Chuck contributed to the family dynamic of the show. Without a successor, it would be impossible to just remove the oldest Cunningham, would it? Television continuity was looser back then, and viewers weren't as inclined to need detailed justifications for each character shift. However, the producers were not yet prepared to completely eliminate Chuck. To keep him in the picture, they made one final attempt. However, the outcome would only increase the notoriety of his disappearance. At least not right away after Gavin O'Hurley left. The filmmakers weren't prepared to give up on Chuck Cunningham entirely. Rather, they subtly changed the role, casting Randolph Roberts to play the part for the rest of season 2. As was customary at the time, the swap was accomplished without providing an explanation on the screen. One week, viewers merely tuned in and discovered, without much hoopla, a new face seated at the Cunningham family table. Chuck and Roberts' rendition retained the same general characteristics. A basketball-playing college student who stopped by for brief, informal interactions before leaving or going upstairs. However, if O'Hurley had thought the part was undeveloped, Roberts soon found himself in a similar situation. His Chuck had 2 appearances, each of which featured succinct, practical conversation that did little to develop his character. He just made brief appearances that seemed more like a courtesy to keep him on the roster. There were no significant plot lines or incidents that defined his character. Roberts' Chuck vanished as abruptly as he had appeared. The oldest Cunningham brother just vanished from the Happy Days universe after his last appearance. He was never again referenced by any character. His whereabouts were not suggested by any scene. Chuck was absent, even during times when it might have made sense for him to attend milestones, graduations, or emotional outbursts as part of a family get-together. The authors of the show seem to have determined that he had never been a member of the family in the first place. Not only was this sudden erasure out of the ordinary, it was conspicuous. In the 1970s, television frequently switched actors, omitted characters, or changed the subject without providing much context. Rarely, however, did a family member completely vanish without any recognition. There was an odd void in the show's continuity, due to the absence of conclusion. Viewers who recalled Chuck were left perplexed when Richie and Joni carried on, as though they had always been the only Cunningham kids. Later, that strange way of addressing Chuck's departure would win a distinct position in television history, and become a shorthand for any character who disappears without a reason. However, at the time, the change was made more to adapt to shifting priorities within the show itself than to create a mythical mystery. This change would fundamentally reinterpret Happy Days, and, ironically, help viewers come to terms with Chuck's absence. Because in a way that no one could have foreseen, another figure was assuming the position of older brother just as Chuck was being deleted. By the early 1980s, Chuck Cunningham's condition had been named Chuck Cunningham Syndrome by television reviewers and devoted viewers, a phrase that would outlive the character and the program. It became the standard abbreviation for any scenario in which a character abruptly and mysteriously vanishes from a television program, never to be seen or spoken of again, as if they had been erased from the program's history. Chuck's removal was more than a casual one, which is why the phrase was created. It essentially changed the Happy Days universe in real time, since it was so thorough and methodical. Indeed, characters had already been dropped from other TV series. A frequent neighbor may abruptly leave, a coworker may discreetly depart from a sitcom at work, or a small supporting character may simply cease to appear. However, Chuck's disappearance was notable due to the potential importance of his function. He wasn't an extra in the background. His absence could not be dismissed, because he was a buddy of a friend. In the Cunningham family, the very family at the heart of the show, he was the oldest child. For anyone who happened to notice, the silence preceding his departure felt odd, even unnerving, just because of that fact. This was more than just a change in casting. It was a vanishing act of narrative, and in a rather deliberate move, the authors stepped up their efforts. Fans who kept watching after Chuck left started to notice how totally the show steered clear of any further mention of him. It was as like Chuck had never been born, and it wasn't a case of, oh, Chuck is away at school, or Chuck's off traveling. Howard and Marion Cunningham would talk about their kids in public by the later seasons. Although they would only mention Richie and Joni, Chuck was absent even during heartfelt, nostalgic episodes that reflected on the family's history, which were ideal occasions for a poignant tribute to a sibling who is no longer there. Perhaps the most definitive erasure was provided by the last season. Howard mentions having 2 children, not 3, in the series' conclusion. Any remaining hope for Chuck's return was silently and irrevocably extinguished in that moment. Pop culture writers were captivated by the spectacle. As soon as the phrase Chuck Cunningham Syndrome gained popularity, it started to appear everywhere in television criticism. It would be used by both fans and entertainment journalists to identify comparable disappearances in other programs. Family Matters' Judy Winslow disappeared in the middle of the series without saying goodbye. After the first season, Minkus from Boy Meets World vanished into thin air. Critics pointed to Happy Days as the quintessential textbook example of the cliché, despite the fact that characters in sitcoms like The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air also quietly left. The syndrome spread throughout the television industry as the years went by. The absence of characters wasn't the only issue. It was about how their absence demonstrated that, if the rest of the show kept viewers interested, comedy viewers at the time were unexpectedly prepared to put up with wide gaps in continuity. The current era, in which internet fan communities analyze every narrative element and demand explanations for even the smallest contradictions, was a stark contrast to this. In those days, a character may just disappear, and many viewers would have forgotten about it after a few weeks. Nevertheless, the lore surrounding Chuck's disappearance suggested that there was a sinister, deep-seated explanation for his absence, a tumultuous behind-the-scenes conflict, a startling scandal, or a contractual dispute that compelled the authors to forget him. The reality, however, was much less dramatic. Chuck's departure was a result of a combination of popular desire, creative decision, and a haphazard test by the show's creator to see how much they could alter without alienating viewers. And the eraser worked because of one thing above all else. One character was growing so much in popularity that he did more than simply take Chuck's place. He caused viewers to forget that Chuck had ever been there. The foundation of Happy Days at the time of its debut was the Cunningham family and their traditional middle-class lifestyle. Chuck was the older brother, Joni was the younger sister, Richie was the main character, and Howard and Marion were the loving but rather traditional parents. However, as the show settled into a rhythm, a new character started to take center stage. Fonzie, whose real name is Arthur Fonzarelli. Fonzie was initially meant to be a cool supporting character who would occasionally appear for comedic effect, or to contrast with Richie's clean-cut demeanor. But fans couldn't get enough of Henry Winkler's natural charisma when he played him. Fonzie was receiving a ton of fan mail before the end of the first season. In addition to following Richie's exploits, viewers were interested in what Fonzie would do next. He possessed the charisma, catchphrases, and swagger that sitcom creators aspire to. There were repercussions from this unexpected spike in popularity. Fonzie started to show up in more episodes, frequently as Richie's mentor, guardian, or mischievous companion. He gradually began to take into the narrative space that might have been occupied by an elder sibling such as Chuck. Do you need some girl advice? It would come from Fonzie. In a difficult circumstance and need backup, there was Fonzie. Although he was never linked to Richie, he became his big brother in a sense. The show's creator, Gary Marshall, observed Winkler and Ron Howard's chemistry. Their joking seemed genuine. Most significantly, spectators adored their vibrant sequences together. Therefore, the authors leaned into their natural attraction to Fonzie, rather than resisting it. Chuck, a figure who lacked depth and a clear goal, was becoming less and less important. When Fonzie could perform all of Chuck's duties and do them better, why keep him around? It was hard to overlook the change in emphasis as Fonzie's fame skyrocketed. He went from wearing a leather jacket as a supporting character to sharing the spotlight with Richie. He was perhaps the show's real star in later seasons. He was featured in merchandise. His cultural effect was so great that Happy Days itself seemed to change around him, and narratives centered around him. Audiences were so engrossed in the Richie-Fonzie dynamic that they hardly turned around by the time Chuck completely vanished. What began as a minor casting adjustment evolved into a total reorientation of the show's focus. Not only had Fonzie taken Chuck's position in the story, but he had also wiped him out of the audience's consciousness. However, Gary Marshall later acknowledged that the choice was not just based on audience preferences. He also believed that Chuck's disappearance was a deliberate artistic experiment. Happy Days writer, Gary Marshall, has talked more candidly about Chuck Cunningham's odd absence. Years after the show solidified its status as one of the most cherished sitcoms on television. Marshall claims that the decision involved more than simply removing a character who wasn't used enough. Additionally, it was a purposeful test of audience interest. His goal was to see if anyone would notice. The looser approach to continuity of the time was reflected in Marshall's thinking. Viewers of sitcoms from the 1970s were used to abrupt transitions. Overnight, sets might be redecorated. Actors may be replaced in the middle of a season without any on-screen justification. And minor characters may disappear without a word. The show continued without looking back if viewers found the new dynamic appealing. Chuck was just the utmost extremity. Marshall likened the choice in one interview to a previous instance from the George Burns and Gracie Allen show, in which an actor was changed without explanation. and viewers swiftly adjusted. According to him, if a sibling in a family sitcom silently disappeared, viewers would be so engrossed in the current plot that they would accept the new situation without asking questions. Surprisingly, that is precisely what took place. In the beginning, there was no public outcry, despite a few fans writing letters to inquire about Chuck's whereabouts. The show's chemistry between Richie and Fonzie kept it strong in the ratings. Marshall's experiment was successful in practice. Chuck's absence was not only accepted by the audience, but many casual watchers gradually forgot he was there at all. This result validated a suspicion held by Marshall and the authors. A character can be dropped from a show with little impact if they are not emotionally ingrained in it, particularly if another character does their function better. From the beginning, Chuck had played in the background. Therefore, the transition of Fona into Richie's older brother role felt seamless and natural. The myth of Chuck's disappearing act, however, took on a life of its own, while the creative team moved on. Television reviewers transformed the mystery into a warning against undeveloped characters, while fans who remembered him turned it into a running joke. Even if the choice was well thought out, Marshall could never have predicted the impact it would have. And, as the years went by, Chuck's absence ceased to be a curious fact about Happy Days. It developed into a whole pop culture phenomena. Despite starting out as a minor behind-the-scenes decision, Chuck Cunningham's disappearance evolved into one of the most persistent mysteries in television history. Finding early episodes featuring Chuck was like discovering a ghost for many viewers, particularly those who watched Happy Days in syndication years after it premiered. He was talking with characters who would later pretend he had never been there. The phrase Chuck Cunningham syndrome was widely used by entertainment journalists by the late 1980s to characterize this type of disappearance. It began to show up in magazine articles, TV comments, and even scholarly debates over serialized narrative. Chuck was cited by critics as the quintessential example of a sitcom character going missing without explanation. Whether it was Tina Pinciotti on That 70s Show, Judy Winslow on Family Matters, or even young children on Saved by the Bell, fan communities used comedy and conjecture to keep the mystery alive. In the early days of the internet, some fans created intricate, humorous hypotheses, and online message boards frequently featured discussions with titles like "Where's Chuck?" or "Justice for Chuck Cunningham." Chuck enrolled in the program for witness protection. In other countries, Chuck became a basketball icon. For 10 years, Chuck was cooped up upstairs reading textbooks. The more absurd the hypothesis, the more it contributed to the mystery's allure. It was impossible for television writers to avoid mentioning the issue. Chuck Cunningham-style jokes about characters going missing were inserted into sitcoms like Scrubs and Arrested Development. In interviews and reunions, even the cast members of Happy Days embraced the comedy in response to Henry Winkler's 2025 social media post. He never came downstairs after going upstairs. A mystery that perfectly pays homage to jokes that have been around for decades. Not simply the peculiarity itself, but also what it revealed about television narrative contributed to the phenomenon's longevity. Chuck's departure shown that viewers will overlook, and occasionally even forget, obvious continuity flaws if a show excels in other aspects, such as humor, character chemistry, or cultural resonance. It served as a reminder that television is not just about rigid narrative logic, but also about perception. Chuck's absence is still being spoken about in think pieces, nostalgia stories, and YouTube videos like this one, almost 50 years after he last went upstairs. Strangely enough, his fame for being wiped has surpassed his fame for even appearing on the show. Even though his brief appearance on film was unmemorable, his disappearance became legendary.